Joins us, and I guess taking on the New York Times a little bit stiff. You're certainly taking issue. The headline of an article is that Senator Rand Paul diverges from his party over voter ID.
Well, it's funny because you say one thing, it goes around the circle, and it comes back, and it's completely different than what you said. I did say that maybe we shouldn't overemphasize this so much, and we need to talk about other things that try to attract new people to the party. But, you know, I grew up in a family where my dad lost an election one time by 200 votes out of 200,000, and we found 3,000 illegal votes. So I'm very aware of voter fraud and think it's not that unreasonable to show your driver's license. But I'm also aware that some people find it that they think it's nefarious, that Republicans are doing this to suppress the African-American vote. So I'm very clear to say that we're not trying to do that. In fact, I'm trying to restore voting rights for minorities who I think have unfairly had their voting rights taken away. How
do you reconcile that, though? You've got one segment of the population who thinks that it's suppressing the vote to show identification. You've got another segment of the population that says, well, if you don't want to show your identification, something simple like a driver's license, what are you hiding? And we also want everyone to be able to vote who's entitled to legally, and we don't want people to vote twice or whatever.
I think it's a perfect example of the problem Republicans have in engaging new voters, African-American voters. There was a time in our history when the vote was suppressed. Actually, it was mostly by Democrats back then. But for some reason, they think Republicans are part of this historical suppression of African-American vote. They think this is just another ploy. So that is the perception. I don't think that is the truth at all. But because it is perceived that way, we need to be aware of people's feelings, and we need to be aware of that and not just go say, oh, well, you know what, let's make our primary election theme to get voter ID. It's not an unreasonable thing to ask to show your identification. You got to show it to see Eric Holder. However, if you want to make it your campaign theme, be aware that some people are offended by it. And that's all I was saying. But I was never saying, oh, I'm against showing your driver's license. So, you know, things kind of get distorted sometimes. But really, the big message I've been taking around the country is that a lot of people, through the war on drugs, have had their voting rights taken from them. They do something foolish when they're 20 years old. They get a felony conviction. They never get to vote again in some states. I actually have testified alongside the NAACP to try to get people's voting rights back if they committed a nonviolent felony.
So what do we do? I mean, so how do we make sure that people aren't suppressed and that we're not terrorizing them by forcing, by almost rolling over them and insisting on identification where it's meant to intimidate them? And how do you make sure we don't have voter fraud so we know who's voting?
It's changing the perception, from my point of view as a Republican, is changing the perception of who we are as a party. People have to not believe ill of what we're trying to do.
How do you do that?
Well, it comes over time because there is a resistance. I mean, I talked to a African-American pastor in Mississippi this last weekend. He said, my wife ran for state representative and she's African-American also as a Republican. He said, I couldn't get any African-Americans vote for her. She couldn't, even face-to-face when they knew she was also from the same community they lived in and all this, because there's a resistance. So there is resistance we have to overcome. Part of that resistance builds into false perceptions, and it's a false perception that showing your driver's license has anything racial about it. But it is a perception, and all I'm saying is we need to be aware of it, and we need to be conscious of people's feelings, or we're never going to get anybody to consider us in the elections.
Well, that may be a divergence from some in your party, because some in your party aren't talking about perception. They're talking about voter ID.
Right. We shouldn't be tone deaf about this, and that's what I'm saying is don't be tone deaf. But I'm also not saying it's an unreasonable idea. You know, most of the government buildings here in Washington, you have to show a driver's license for. So I'm not opposed to the idea, but let's don't be tone deaf and say, oh, you know what, it's no big deal. It is perceived in some communities as being something nefarious that Republicans are doing. So we have to change people's perception of us as a party so they'll listen more to what we're trying to do.
Some people think that Senator Marco Rubio may have taken a shot at you today. He said something to the effect that you shouldn't be running for president and the Senate simultaneously. I realize that you haven't announced you're running for the presidency, but nonetheless, everyone sees as a veiled shot across the bow at you.
Now, Marco and I are good friends, so I think I would be the first to know if he were taking a shot at me. So, no, I don't think so. I think no matter who runs, I'm sort of a Republican who believes in peace and commerce with all Republicans, and I'm going to try to keep it on a high plane.
But you haven't made an admission running for president.
No, I haven't
I didn't walk you into making that admission or denial.
Yeah, I haven't decided yet, but I'm thinking about it and discussing with family, but won't make a decision probably till early next year.
Senator, nice to see you.
Thank you.